Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, welcome to the third lecture of week 6 on the topic modernization and creative communication. So in this lecture we will see how communication gaps leads to misunderstanding and as consequence the dialogic challenges thereof. Now see, when we have talked about the letters, the telephone and the radio, the basic problem that we have faced or we have seen is the gap in communication, whether it's about the audience perception, whether the sender's problem, but there is a gap. So now we have to concentrate where the gap is and why, and we have to understand the problem of communication gap. So let's start by discussing the concept of communication gaps. So what do you mean by this? Essentially, this refers to the disconnects and misunderstandings that can happen during conversation or any kind of interactions. These gaps are more common than we might think of, and they can occur when people fail to fully understand or respond to each other. Now think about a conversation where you feel like you are talking but the other person doesn't quite get what you are saying, or the dialogue feels very incomplete. That's a communication gap in action. A lot of this stems from modern communication styles. We live in a very fast-paced world where technology plays a big role in how we communicate. Things like text messages, emails, and social media often speed up the conversation but can also lead to incomplete messages or incomplete exchanges. Think about how easily a text can be misinterpreted because the tone isn't clear. Right. So while technology has given us new way to connect, it also created new ways for misunderstandings to happen. Now, to better our understanding on this, how communication affects us today, let us take a brief look at the past. If you are very familiar with the works of Anton Chekhov or Ibsen or Strindberg, you will notice something very interesting about the way their characters speak. They often talk past each other, meaning their conversation don't always directly respond to what the other person is saying. This creates a sense of disconnection. In a way, their dialogue mirrors how we sometimes communicate today, where we speak but we don't really connect or respond meaningfully. And then we have more modern playwrights like Samuel Beckett and Woody Allen who took this idea further. And when we talk about Samuel Beckett, you will recall the work, the most famous work, Waiting for Godot, right? And you will, I think you can recollect the dialogue between Didi and Gogo. Their communication has no meaning. The words have baseless words, we call, and that's why we call them absurd, right? So Beckett now used this miscommunication not just to show frustration or disconnection, but also to create comedy and even tragedy. Their works reflect the human condition, where people often misunderstand each other, leading to both humorous and sad outcomes. It's interesting to think that while technology is often blamed for communication gaps today, this problem has been a part of human interactions for centuries. Raymond Williams, a well-known critic, of course, even pointed out this, that how dialogue has shifted to a place where people no longer directly speak to each other, and they do not directly speak to each other, but in fragmented and distracted ways, much like what we see with modern technology, right? So now let's talk about how the modern conversations actually work. In many cases, dialogue today is fragmented. Have you ever noticed that in some conversation, it feels like people are just broadcasting at each other? What I mean by this is that they are talking but not necessarily responding to each other or each other's point of view. So they do not consider each other's point of view, right? Very alienated. So what happens here? This happens often in a group setting, like in meetings or even in online group chats. You say something and the other say something else, right? The conversation becomes a collection of incomplete exchanges, and people end up feeling like they are not really being heard. Another common issue is the gap between conversational turns. For example, in face-to-face conversation, long pauses or interruptions can make the dialogue feel very disjointed, right? Silence in particular can create discomfort, and this discomfort can widen the communication gap because it makes people feel like they are not connecting, or otherwise they start feeling what the other may be perceiving, why the other is taking so much of time, right? So this fragmentation is even more pronounced in public communication. Take news broadcasts or social media interactions, for example. These are often cross-cut with different stories or threads. So it's very hard to maintain a clear and focused dialogue. You might be watching the news, but the ways the stories jump from one topic to another can make the communication feel incomplete. So you do not get the real story or the origin of the story. We get distracted by so many narratives being created or curated within the passage of time, right? So now it's very important point here, the gap between sending a message and receiving it. This gap can happen for a number of reasons. Sometimes it's a delay in the transmission, like when you send a letter, as we had already discussed, or nowadays we send an email and we have to wait for a reply. Other times the gap happens even when we are talking face to face. Just because you are physically present with someone doesn't mean you are truly connecting with them. You can be sitting across for someone and still not fully understand what they are saying. An extreme example of this is talking to someone in a coma, right? While you are physically there, the connection isn't happening. Then let's consider electronic media. Devices like radio, televisions and phones have created a new kind of communication gap. For instance, when you listen to the radio, you are only receiving the message without any chance to respond, that we have already discussed. So there is no way, no scope of reverse flow of communication, which we call as feedback. This one-way communication can feel impersonal and create a bigger gap between the sender and receiver, because it's not a true dialogue. The receiver doesn't have the chance to ask for clarification or engage in a back and forth conversation, marking the communication incomplete. Now, if you want to find out, or if you want to connect with today's way of communication, you take the example of WhatsApp. What you do, you send a message and you wait for that double blue tick, and unless and until that blue tick or double tick appears, you feel anxious, right? The single tick makes you anxious. There where the communication gaps, those gaps are created. You are anxious, you blame the network, or you blame, and even there is a double tick, the receiver doesn't respond, you blame the receiver, right? So these are certain gaps that become really difficult for the communication to flow effectively. So now we have to see how we can negotiate with the communication gap. So how do we handle these communication gaps? One important concept here is the negotiation of meaning. What this means? This means that during a conversation, both speakers need to work together to make sure they understand each other. This is something we often do without thinking, like when we ask follow-up questions or give feedback during a conversation. However, even the most skilled communicators can struggle when there are long pauses or breaks in the communication or in the conversation. These interruptions can cause anxiety and disrupt the flow of the dialogue, making the communication gap even wider. Another challenge is the uncertainty of connection. Even if we send a message with a specific person in mind, we can't always be sure that the message will be received or interpreted in the way we intended. This uncertainty creates opportunities for misunderstanding, which can lead to communication breakdowns. Now, here's a fascinating story about communication. William James, a famous philosopher and psychologist of his times, was once giving a lecture about the physiology of a turtle's heart. During the lecture, the heart projection he was showing wasn't behaving as expected. I mean, it wasn't pulsating. So what did he do? He manipulated the projection to make it look like the heart was beating. Now, what's the lesson here? It's that communication isn't just about delivering raw, unfiltered truth. Instead, it is about the way making sure that the receiver understands the concept, even if that means adjusting the way the message is presented. This story teaches us a very important lesson. Communication is more about responsibility to the audience than fidelity to the original message. In other words, it's not always about sticking to the truth of the message, but about ensuring the receiver grasps what you are trying to convey. Miscommunication is then a regular occurrence in modern life, and it happens both in the personal and professional spaces, professional and personal interactions. For example, You think, how many times have you sent an email or text message that was completely misunderstood? Many times, right? Maybe you have had an awkward moment where a joke you made in a text didn't land the way you thought it would, or an important point in an email was overlooked. These misunderstandings are even more likely to happen in a world where most of our conversations, most of our communication happens through the digital medium. Technology, while making communication faster, often amplifies communication or amplifies miscommunication. When we communicate through text or emails, we lose what? We lose the nonverbal cues that help us understand each other. Things like tone of voice, pitch, facial expressions, and the gestures and postures that we make during conversations, right? So these cues play a huge role in helping us interpret the meaning. So without them, it's easy for the message to be misinterpreted. It is easy for the message to get interpreted the way you want it. The receiver intends to, not the sender had interpreted, right? And because we are always connected, sending messages throughout the day or on multiple platforms that we have, the chances for misunderstandings grow faster. So, communication, as I have already mentioned, is not just about sending messages. It's really about how that message is received. A lot of the time, we focus too much on expression or expressing our own truth or being authentic, but this focus on authenticity can actually be problematic. Now you might question why. Because authenticity tends to prioritize the sender's truth over the receiver's understanding or misunderstanding. In other words, we might be so concerned with expressing ourselves that we forget to make sure the other person's whether he understands or not, right? So William James suggested that the true goal of communication should be about making sure the other person gets it, the other person understands it or comprehends what the sender wants him or her to understand, right? So it's not just about saying what you want to say, it's about ensuring the other person receives the message in the way you intended. As I said earlier, we both have to, being the sender and the receiver, we both have to be on the same page. This idea challenges the notion that the sender's message is the most important part of communication and shifts the focus to the receiver's interpretation. Now, when we turn our attention to public communication such as media broadcasts or online discourse, we see a lot of fragmentation. This fragmentation is partly due to the multitude of voices and perspectives competing for attention in the public sphere. For instance, when we watch the news or scroll through social media, we are bombarded with different kinds of videos, stories, opinions and advertisements, all fighting for gaining our focus, our attention, right? So this creates a fragmented dialogue that makes it harder to find meaningful connection. The literary theorist Bakhtin had an interesting view on this. He believed that dialogue, especially in the public sphere, isn't an ideal exchange of ideas. Instead, it's more like a chaotic mix of voices, where it's difficult to create real understanding between the speaker and the listener. This view highlights the challenges we face in the modern public communication, where technology often mediates and disrupts our ability to truly connect. Now let us talk about how can we overcome these communication gaps. One of the most effective ways to close the gap is through active listening. This means really paying attention to the speaker and providing feedback that shows you are engaged in the conversation. For example, asking clarifying questions or summarizing what the other person has said can help ensure that both parties are thinking, analyzing everything in the same manner, right? So technology can also help bridge the gap. For instance, video calls allow us to see visual cues like facial expressions or body languages, like the gestures you make, which help enhance our understanding. This is why video meetings often feel more personal and more connected than the phone calls or the emails. But the most important factor in closing communication gaps is empathy. Empathy means what? Means putting yourself in the other person's shoes and focusing on their needs and understanding. Instead of, just trying to get your point across, you are actively thinking about how the other person is interpreting the message. The goal here isn't just to transmit information, but to create a real connection. So, to sum up what we discussed so far, we can say that, or we have seen that communication gaps are a part of modern life or modern communication system. Whether it's because of technology or personal misunderstanding, these gaps happen all the time. The key to overcoming them is to focus on the receiver. Make sure the person you are communicating with understands your message. Active listening, empathy, and a bit of technological help can go a long way in bridging these gaps. Remember, true communication isn't just about getting the message out accurately, it's about creating mutual understanding between the sender and the receiver. Thank you.